Eleanor Whitmore sat at the long mahogany dining table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above, casting light on her family's sharp expressions. Her father, Richard, sat at the head with Margaret by his side. Charles lounged across from her, smirking as though he already knew how the evening would unfold. The Whitmores had always been a family of power. Their wealth stretched back generations, rooted in industries Eleanor found stifling. Shipping, manufacturing, real estate. To them, prestige was inherited, not earned. But Eleanor had never fit their mold. "Eleanor," Richard began, his voice deep, resonant, and edged with impatience. "We've reviewed your proposal. Opening your own design consultancy? Without Whitmore backing." He shook his head slowly like a judge handing down a sentence. "You'll fail within a year. Maybe less." Charles laughed. 6 months at best. Her mother raised her wine glass delicately. "Darling, why put yourself through this embarrassment? You have everything you need here. Your father built an empire for you. Why throw it away chasing what? Independence." The words landed like daggers, but Eleanor's chest burned with determination. "I don't want your empire," she said firmly. "I'll build my own." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the soft clink of Charles's fork against his plate. Her father leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "And when you fail, Eleanor? When you come crawling back, humiliated, begging for help?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I won't." But as she pushed her chair back and stood, Eleanor knew this was no longer just about business. It was war. The night air outside the Whitmore estate felt sharper than usual, as if the world itself was reminding Eleanor of the weight of the decision she had just made. She walked down the gravel driveway, her heels crunching against the stones, every step echoing in her chest. Behind her, the mansion's windows glowed like watchful eyes, but she refused to turn back. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just leaving the house. She was leaving behind the safety net her family had draped around her since childhood. A golden cage was still a cage, and tonight she had broken free. Her small car, parked near the iron gates, looked almost laughable compared to her father's fleet of luxury vehicles. But as she slid into the driver's seat, a strange thrill coursed through her. This was hers. Imperfect, worn, but hers. Driving into London that night, she thought about everything she didn't have. No office, no staff, no capital. She had only her vision and a handful of sketches tucked into her bag. The start of a consultancy that blended architecture with sustainable design. A bold idea, but one her family had scoffed at. "Fairy tales don't build empires," Charles had said. Maybe not. But determination did. Eleanor moved into a small flat in Shoreditch, the kind of place her mother would call bohemian with a wrinkled nose. It was cramped with peeling paint and a temperamental boiler, but it overlooked a bustling street lined with cafes, art studios, and young entrepreneurs chasing their dreams. For Eleanor, it was perfect. The next morning, she spread her designs across the tiny kitchen table, papers spilling onto the floor. She scribbled business plans late into the night, teaching herself the harsh realities of costs, suppliers, and marketing. Every mistake felt like a stumble, but she reminded herself, this was hers to build. Still, the doubts crept in. She remembered Richard's words, sharp as broken glass. "You'll come crawling back." Would she? What if he was right? Her phone buzzed. A message from Clara lit the screen. "Heard about last night. I'm proud of you. Coffee tomorrow? My treat." Relief washed over Eleanor. Clara had always been her anchor, the one who believed in her when no one else did. The next day at a corner cafe, Clara leaned across the table, her curly auburn hair falling into her face. "So, you've really done it. You've walked away from Whitmore money." Eleanor sipped her coffee, trying to hide the tremor in her hand. "I'd rather fail on my own than succeed in their shadow." Clara grinned. "Good. Because I think you're going to shock them all." Eleanor wanted to believe that. But as the days turned into weeks, reality pressed harder. Clients weren't knocking down her door. Her savings dwindled. Some nights she ate nothing but instant noodles, staring at the ceiling and wondering if her father was laughing somewhere, waiting for her inevitable collapse. But she refused to give in. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, drenched from running across town to pitch her designs, she stumbled into her flat to find a business card slipped under her door. It read, James Aldrich, venture capitalist. And scribbled beneath, your ideas have potential. Call me. Eleanor stared at the card, her heart hammering. For the first time since leaving Whitmore Estate, she felt the spark of something bigger than defiance, hope. The business card felt almost too light in Eleanor's hand for something that carried so much weight. She turned it over again and again, as though some hidden answer might be tucked within the embossed lettering. James Aldrich, venture capitalist. She had never heard of him, though the name rang faintly familiar, perhaps from one of the endless social gatherings her parents had dragged her to over the years. Still, venture capitalists didn't simply leave notes under doors. That alone sent a rush of adrenaline through her. Clara came over that evening, her eyes widening as Eleanor showed her the card. Do you think it's real? Eleanor asked, half afraid the whole thing was some elaborate prank orchestrated by her brother. Clara frowned. The handwriting doesn't scream Charles. He'd have sent a sarcastic letter on Whitmore letterhead. They laughed, the tension cracking for just a moment. But Eleanor couldn't shake the nerves. Was this genuine interest, or the first step into another trap? That night, she drafted and deleted a dozen different emails before finally settling on a short, professional reply. Mr. Aldrich, I received your card. I would be interested in meeting to discuss further. Sincerely, Eleanor Whitmore. She hesitated before hitting send, her family name glaring back at her. Should she even use it? The Whitmore name was powerful, but also cursed. It came with baggage she wasn't sure she wanted attached to her dream. Yet leaving it off entirely felt like lying. With a deep breath she pressed send and waited. The response came the next morning. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. My office, Canary Wharf. Come prepared. The brevity of the message was both intimidating and exhilarating. Eleanor spent the next 24 hours preparing. She printed designs, polished her financial projections, and rehearsed her pitch until her voice grew hoarse. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, she adjusted her blazer, her hazel eyes staring back with a mix of fear and fire. Don't you dare stumble now, she whispered to herself. Canary Wharf gleamed under a pale sky as she approached the towering glass building where James Aldrich's firm was headquartered. Men in suits and women in sharp heels streamed in and out, their confidence radiating in waves. Eleanor felt the weight of her worn briefcase in her hand and reminded herself she had just as much right to be here as anyone else. James's office sat at the top floor, the city skyline sprawling beyond the glass walls. He rose from his desk as she entered, tall and sharp-eyed, his presence commanding but not unkind. Miss Whitmore, he said, shaking her hand firmly. I've been waiting to meet you. Eleanor forced a calm smile. I wasn't expecting your card. Opportunities rarely announce themselves politely, he replied, gesturing for her to sit. Your designs, sustainable, modern, adaptable. I came across them through an associate. They're different. Fresh. Her heart skipped. Different is often dismissed as impossible. James leaned forward, studying her. Which is why I like it. Tell me, Eleanor. Are you willing to risk everything for this? The question struck her like a thunderbolt. Images flashed. Her father's scorn, her mother's dismissive glance, Charles's smug laughter. She thought of the cold dinners in the Whitmore mansion, where her voice had been drowned out by arrogance. Yes, she said firmly. I'd rather risk everything than settle for nothing. James's lips curved into a small smile. Good. Then let's talk about how we build something your family can't ignore. For the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like she was running away from the Whitmores. She was standing on the first stone of her own empire. James Aldrich didn't waste time. The moment Eleanor agreed to take the risk, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as though measuring her worth in silence. Finally he spoke. There's a property development firm, Carrington and Hale, he began. They're looking to revamp one of their flagship sites. They've heard a dozen pitches already. Tomorrow you'll present yours. Eleanor's chest tightened. Tomorrow? James, I've only just started. I don't even have. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. Excuses are for the ones who stay small. You want an empire? Prove it. You have 24 hours. Her pulse roared in her ears. The rational part of her wanted to protest, to say it was impossible. But the fire inside, the one her father had mocked, the one Charles had laughed at, flared. Fine, she said, lifting her chin. I'll be ready. James smiled faintly, as though that was the answer he had been waiting for. The next 24 hours became a blur of papers, sketches, and sleepless determination. Eleanor worked on her kitchen table until her hands cramped, coffee cups piling high around her. Clara stopped by at midnight, dropping off takeaway and watching her friend scribble furiously. Are you sure about this? Clara asked gently. Eleanor didn't look up. I have to be. She imagined her father's voice sneering. You'll crawl back. No, not this time. By dawn her pitch was ready. Exhaustion clung to her, but adrenaline pushed her forward. Carrington and Hale's headquarters buzzed with quiet power. Sleek suits moved through the lobby, polished floors reflecting ambition itself. Eleanor tightened her grip on the briefcase. She felt small, like an imposter sneaking into a world that wasn't hers. But then she remembered Richard Whitmore's cold eyes, Charles's cruel smirk. They thought she couldn't do this. That was all the fuel she needed. The boardroom was long, glass-walled, intimidating. 6 men and women sat across the table, their expressions blank, waiting. James stood at the back, arms folded, his eyes on her. Not to rescue her, but to see if she'd survive. Eleanor took a breath and began. She spoke of design that wasn't just aesthetic but purposeful. Of buildings that breathed, that gave back to the environment rather than drained it. She laid out her vision of sustainability woven with modern elegance. Her words steady even as her hands trembled slightly against the papers. At first, the board members looked unconvinced. One of them, a sharp-faced man in his 50s, interrupted. This sounds idealistic. Do you have proof it can be profitable? Eleanor paused. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on her. She thought of her father's empire, built on ruthless numbers and endless profit margins. And then she thought of why she had walked away, to create something different. Something lasting. Profit doesn't come from following trends, she said, her voice clear. It comes from leading them. Sustainability isn't just an ideal. It's the future. And those who ignore it will be left behind. The man sat back, frowning, but he didn't interrupt again. When she finished, there was silence. Then one of the women on the board leaned forward, a spark of interest in her eyes. We'll consider it. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no either. Afterward, James joined her in the lobby. His expression was unreadable. Well? She asked, trying not to let her nerves show. He studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. You didn't crumble. That's something. Now we wait. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the first time someone other than Clara had listened to her without dismissing her outright. As she walked back into the city streets, the morning sun broke through the clouds. For the first time since leaving the Whitmore mansion, Eleanor felt she might just have a fighting chance. The news spread faster than Eleanor could have imagined. She hadn't even received a call back from Carrington and Hale before her phone lit up with a message from Clara. Your family knows. Eleanor froze in the middle of her tiny flat, the text glaring back at her. Of course they knew. London's business world was a small, glittering pond, and the Whitmores were the sharks circling beneath the surface. One bold pitch in front of Carrington and Hale would never stay secret. By evening, her father had summoned her. Not invited, summoned. The Whitmore estate was exactly as she remembered. Polished marble floors, sweeping staircases, walls lined with portraits of ancestors who stared down as if silently judging. As Eleanor stepped into the great hall, the air felt colder, heavier. Richard waited in his study, the same room where he had once lectured her on how the world works. Margaret perched beside him, her posture elegant, her eyes sharp with disapproval. Charles leaned against the fireplace, smirking like a cat who had cornered a mouse. So, Richard began, his voice smooth but laced with steel, my daughter thinks she can challenge me. Eleanor steadied her breath. I didn't pitch to Carrington and Hale to challenge you. I pitched because I believe in my work. Charles laughed under his breath. Believe all you like, Ellie. They'll chew you up. This isn't university anymore. It's war. Her mother's gaze softened, but only slightly. Darling, why put yourself through this? You're embarrassing yourself. These firms respect power, not passion. That's why they called your father, not you, for decades. Richard leaned forward. his silver hair glinting under the lamplight. "Do you really think you can win in my city without my blessing? London doesn't bend for dreamers, Eleanor. It crushes them." For a moment, fear threatened to claw its way up her throat. But then she remembered the boardroom, the way the woman on the Carrington board had leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. For once someone had listened. That memory was a shield. "I don't need your blessing," she said quietly but firmly. "And I won't let you stop me." The room fell silent. Richard's jaw tightened. "Then don't expect me to save you when you fall. I'm not asking you to." She turned to leave, but Charles's voice followed her. "You'll be back within 6 months, Eleanor. And when you are, I'll be the one running Whitmore Enterprises. Don't think Father will even have space for you then." Eleanor didn't look back. The car ride home was quiet, but her mind roared. She had wanted to prove herself, yes, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly this would become a battlefield. Richard wouldn't just ignore her. He would fight to keep her down. Later that night, as she sat by the window of her flat, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky, her phone buzzed again. A new message from James Aldrich. "Carrington and Hale are interested. They want a follow-up meeting. This is your chance." Eleanor's breath caught. This was it. The first crack in the fortress her father had built. But she knew one thing for certain. Richard Whitmore had heard the same whispers she had. And he would not let her win quietly. Eleanor barely slept the night before her second meeting with Carrington and Hale. She lay awake in her cramped flat, her sketches spread across the floor like scattered pieces of her future. Every creak of the old radiator reminded her how far she had fallen from the luxury of the Whitmore estate, and how much further she had to climb. By morning her nerves were a storm. She dressed carefully, choosing a tailored navy suit she had saved for rare occasions. Clara stopped by with coffee and a reassuring smile. "You've got this," Clara said, squeezing her hand. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I wish I believed that as much as you do." "You don't have to believe it," Clara replied. "You just have to walk in there and make them believe it." Carrington and Hale's office was even more intimidating the second time. The gleaming corridors hummed with quiet authority, and Eleanor felt every pair of eyes on her as she walked toward the boardroom. James was already there, leaning against the wall with that cool, unreadable expression. When she entered, he gave the faintest nod, a silent reminder that this was her fight, not his. The board sat waiting, their faces a blend of curiosity and caution. Eleanor began her presentation, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. She spoke of modular designs that could adapt to shifting market needs, of green technology that would future-proof their investments, of elegance married with efficiency. For a moment she saw something shift, interest, maybe even respect. But then the door opened, and in walked Richard Whitmore. Eleanor's breath caught. He strode into the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, his presence commanding instant attention. The board members straightened, murmurs rippling through the room. "Apologies for the interruption," Richard said smoothly. "I couldn't resist the chance to see my daughter's project." "Daughter?" The word dripped with condescension. Eleanor's pulse thundered. Of course. He couldn't stand the idea of her succeeding without his shadow looming overhead. One of the board members, the sharp-faced man from last time, looked intrigued. "Mr. Whitmore, we weren't expecting you." Richard smiled. "Nor was I. But when I heard Eleanor was presenting, I felt compelled to come. Family after all." The implication was clear. She was still his, still under his thumb. Eleanor forced herself to keep going, her voice steady, though every word now felt like a battle. She finished her pitch, and the board turned expectant eyes toward Richard. He didn't hesitate. "My daughter has always been imaginative," he said. "But Carrington and Hale need results, not fairy tales. If you want Whitmore backing, I'd be happy to propose an alternative, something proven, something safe." The board shifted uncomfortably, torn between the stability Richard represented and the spark Eleanor offered. Eleanor clenched her fists under the table. This was her nightmare. Her father not just dismissing her in private, but dismantling her in front of the very people she needed to impress. She drew a breath. "With respect, Father," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "your way may have worked in the past. But times are changing. Playing it safe is what will sink you now." Carrington and Hale asked for innovation. That's what I'm offering. Not Whitmore's past, my future. A silence fell. Richard's jaw tightened, his silver eyes glinting with fury. But one of the women on the board leaned forward again, that same spark of intrigue in her gaze. Thank you, Miss Whitmore, she said, ignoring Richard completely. We'll be in touch. It wasn't victory, but it was survival. And Eleanor knew one thing as she walked out of that boardroom. Richard Whitmore would not forgive her for challenging him in public. The days following her confrontation at Carrington and Hale were a blur of waiting in silence. Every morning, Eleanor checked her email with trembling hands, praying for a response. But nothing came. By the end of the week, James called her into his office. He didn't bother with pleasantries. They've gone cold, he said flatly. Eleanor's stomach sank. Cold? But they seemed interested. They were, James replied, his jaw tightening. Until Richard Whitmore paid them a visit. He reminded them of his connections, his power, and his money. Suddenly, your future didn't look so appealing compared to his empire. Eleanor felt her chest constrict, a mix of rage and despair. She should have known he wouldn't fight fair. Her father didn't just compete, he destroyed. So that's it, she whispered. One word from him and I'm finished? James studied her, his expression unreadable. That depends. Do you want to quit now and prove him right? Or do you want to learn how to fight the way he fights? Her fists clenched. I want to fight. James leaned back in his chair, almost smiling. Good. Then you need someone who knows Richard Whitmore's playbook better than anyone. There's a man you should meet, Arthur Blake. The name meant nothing to Eleanor, but James's tone was serious. The next evening, he brought her to a quiet pub in Southwark, the kind of place that smelled of wood smoke and secrets. In a corner booth sat a man in his late 40s, rugged and broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that had seen too much. Arthur, James said, clapping him on the shoulder. This is Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter of your old friend. Arthur's gaze flicked to her, cool and assessing. Whitmore's daughter. Brave of you to show your face here. Eleanor frowned. I don't understand. Arthur leaned back, nursing his pint. Your father ruined me. 10 years ago, I ran a firm that was competing for a government contract. Richard undercut me, spread lies about my finances, bribed the right people. I lost everything. Wife, house, business, all gone. That's how he works. Ruthless. Efficient. Eleanor's stomach turned. She had known her father was ruthless, but hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the bitterness in Arthur's eyes, made it real in a way it never had been before. So why meet with me? She asked cautiously. Arthur's eyes hardened. Because maybe it's time someone gave Whitmore a taste of his own medicine. And you? He studied her again, softer this time. You've got the fire to do it. But fire without strategy burns out fast. Eleanor leaned forward. Teach me. Arthur chuckled darkly. Careful what you ask for, girl. Once you start playing at Richard's level, there's no turning back. I don't want to turn back, Eleanor said firmly. I want to build something he can't destroy. Arthur nodded slowly, as though weighing her soul. Finally he raised his glass. Then welcome to the real game. That night, Eleanor walked home with her mind reeling. She had gained a new ally, but also a terrifying glimpse into the battlefield she was stepping onto. Her father wasn't just an obstacle. He was a predator. And to survive, she'd have to become something he never expected. His equal. Arthur Blake had become Eleanor's secret weapon. For the first time in her life, she was learning how the game of power really worked. It wasn't just about innovation or talent. It was about strategy, timing, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. They met in a quiet office space, far from the polished surfaces of Whitmore's world. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with finance manuals, biographies of legendary entrepreneurs, and framed newspaper articles detailing the very battles Eleanor's father had fought and won. Arthur handed her a notebook. Every move your father makes is calculated, he said. He doesn't just attack, he anticipates. If you want to survive, you have to anticipate him first. Eleanor nodded, flipping through the pages, absorbing the lessons he laid out. They simulated scenarios: hostile meetings, boardroom negotiations, public relations disasters. Arthur forced her to think 3 steps ahead. teaching her how to project confidence while concealing doubt, how to pivot under pressure, and how to negotiate in ways that made even the most powerful partners feel they were winning. Her first real test came unexpectedly. A supplier Eleanor had been relying on called to inform her that Richard Whitmore had intervened, threatening to pull the company's other contracts unless they severed ties with her firm. Arthur leaned back, watching her reaction. "And now, Eleanor, you either fold or you fight smarter." She clenched her fists, then took a deep breath. "We fight smarter." Within hours, she had drafted an alternative plan, sourcing multiple smaller suppliers, negotiating slightly higher prices but securing more reliable delivery. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than surrender. When she told Arthur about it, he gave a rare approving smile. "This is how you win, Eleanor. By turning every attempt to stop you into an opportunity." That night, Eleanor sat in her flat, exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time, she felt like she had a plan, a real strategy to challenge her father's dominance. But deep down, she knew the coming months would test everything she had learned. Because Richard Whitmore didn't play fair. And now she was learning how to play like him. Richard didn't wait long. A week after Eleanor's supplier victory, she received a formal notice that one of her key prospective clients had rescinded their interest. The email was curt, professional, but the undertone was unmistakable: Whitmore influence at work. Eleanor's first instinct was panic. But she reminded herself of Arthur's lessons. Assess, adapt, strike strategically. She called Clara and explained the situation. "I knew he wouldn't let me succeed quietly," Eleanor said, her voice steady but cold. Clara sighed. "You're not going to let him intimidate you, right?" "I'm going to use it," Eleanor replied. "Every roadblock he throws at me will make me smarter, more prepared." She reached out to James Aldridge, who immediately saw the opportunity. "This is why we diversify," he said. "Let him think he's blocking you. Meanwhile, we expand into other markets he can't touch. Let him waste energy chasing ghosts while you build the real empire." Within days, Eleanor had turned the situation around. She targeted new clients overseas, leveraged emerging technologies, and presented a stronger, more resilient front. The client loss to Whitmore influence didn't matter in the long term. Eleanor was creating a foundation that no single interference could crumble. Arthur watched her work and finally said, "Now you're learning, Eleanor. Richard may have the fire of a dragon, but you've got the cunning of a fox. Never underestimate what that combination can do." For the first time, Eleanor began to believe. Not just that she could survive without her family's help, but that she could thrive. With every day that passed, Eleanor's confidence grew, but so did Richard Whitmore's attempts to undermine her. He had always believed that fear and intimidation could control people, but Eleanor had learned to anticipate his moves, often turning them into advantages. Her empire was no longer a fragile dream. It was a living, growing entity that refused to be smothered by her father's shadow. Her office hummed with activity. Designers, strategists, and junior analysts moved efficiently, executing plans Eleanor had spent months perfecting. Each successful project was a small victory, a step further away from the suffocating world of the Whitmores. Yet, even as she watched her team thrive, Eleanor knew she could not afford complacency. Her father's influence reached far beyond their family. He had allies in every corner of the business world, and he had yet to unleash his full arsenal against her. Then came the first public test. A major London architecture award was announced, recognizing the most innovative firms of the year. Eleanor's firm had submitted several projects, and the shortlist placed her alongside some of the most established firms in the country. Winning would mean recognition, credibility, and a symbolic victory over her father, who had always dictated the city's business narrative. Richard, of course, noticed immediately. His influence began circulating rumors, quiet whispers that Eleanor's projects were flashy but superficial, unproven in real-world applications, and too ambitious for a young, inexperienced firm. Eleanor heard about these rumors from a source who wished to remain anonymous, an employee at a rival firm. Rather than panic, she studied the situation carefully. This was exactly what Arthur had warned her about: distractions, psychological pressure, and attempts to sway public opinion. Instead of reacting emotionally, Eleanor doubled down. She organized a showcase, inviting journalists, city planners, and potential clients to experience her designs firsthand. She prepared her presentations meticulously, highlighting sustainability, functionality, and aesthetic excellence. Every detail was polished to perfection. The night of the awards arrived. Eleanor's heart pounded as she entered the grand hall, her team flanking her with quiet confidence. Cameras flashed, microphones buzzed, and the air was thick with anticipation. When the award for Most Innovative Architecture Firm was announced, Eleanor's firm was called first. She felt a surge of triumph, pride mixing with relief. This was more than recognition. It was a statement to her father. She could succeed without his help. Yet, as she stood on stage, accepting the award and smiling for the cameras, Eleanor knew the battle was far from over. Richard Whitmore would not retreat quietly, and Charles, ever the opportunist, was likely plotting his own move. But for the first time, Eleanor felt the taste of real victory. It wasn't just about the award, it was about proving to herself and to the world that she belonged here. After the ceremony, James Aldridge approached her, a rare smile on his face. "You're building more than an empire, Eleanor. You're building respect. Your father will notice sooner or later, and when he does, well, you'll be ready." Eleanor nodded, the weight of her journey pressing on her shoulders, but also a fire burning within her. She had faced intimidation, sabotage, and doubt, and she had emerged stronger. The empire she was building was no longer just a dream. It was a legacy in the making. As she walked through the hall, receiving congratulations and handshakes, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction. She had survived the shadow of her family, and now she was ready to cast her own light. The taste of victory at the Architecture Awards only fueled Eleanor's drive. She returned to her office with renewed energy, determined to solidify the foundation she had fought so hard to build. Every decision from this point on mattered. Every partnership, every project, every strategic move could either strengthen her empire or expose a vulnerability her father could exploit. Arthur Blake continued to guide her, teaching her the subtleties of negotiations, public relations, and long-term strategy. "Eleanor," he said one afternoon, "an empire isn't just about winning contracts. It's about creating networks of loyalty. Your strength comes from people who trust you, and trust that you will protect them, even when the stakes are high." She took his words to heart. Eleanor began meeting personally with her team, investing time in mentoring and listening to ideas from designers and analysts alike. She implemented transparent policies, incentives, and shared a vision that inspired loyalty. Slowly, her firm was no longer just a collection of employees. It became a cohesive force, united under a single purpose. Meanwhile, her father was not idle. Whispers of his disapproval traveled quickly through the industry, and some small clients began to second-guess Eleanor's firm, unsure whether aligning with her meant crossing a man of Richard Whitmore's influence. But Eleanor had anticipated this. Diversifying her client base, seeking partnerships abroad, and cultivating a reputation for innovation made her resilient. The Whitmore name was a shadow she refused to hide under. Instead, she used it to her advantage, highlighting her independence and vision in interviews and presentations. Eleanor also strengthened her relationship with James Aldridge, whose strategic counsel became invaluable. "We need to expand your influence beyond London," he advised. "Look at emerging markets. Build alliances. Your father can't touch those areas yet." She followed his advice meticulously. Projects in Manchester, Edinburgh, and even as far as Dublin began to take shape under her firm's brand. Each successful project reinforced her credibility, and soon the industry began to recognize Eleanor Whitmore as a force to be reckoned with, not just a young architect with a famous surname, but a visionary leader in her own right. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings and site inspections, Eleanor sat alone in her office, looking out at the city skyline. The lights of London stretched endlessly before her, and she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had come so far, from the cramped flat in Shoreditch to this thriving enterprise. Yet she knew the real challenge was maintaining the momentum. Every victory had attracted more scrutiny. Every success made her father more determined to undermine her. Clara called that night, sensing Eleanor's tension. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said. "Don't lose sight of why you started this." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I remember. It's not just about proving them wrong anymore. It's about proving to myself that I can build something lasting. Something they can't touch. Clara laughed softly. And believe me, Eleanor, they're noticing. Your father is starting to realize he can't control you anymore. A flicker of satisfaction warmed Eleanor. Richard's attempts to dominate her world had only made her stronger, more strategic, and more determined. For the first time, she felt the true meaning of independence. Not just financial but emotional and intellectual. As she turned off the lights and walked out of her office, Eleanor knew the battle was far from over. Richard Whitmore would escalate his efforts, Charles would look for opportunities to exploit, and the business world would throw obstacles in her path. But Eleanor was no longer the unsure young woman who had walked away from her family's wealth. She was a leader, a strategist, and a force, and she was ready for whatever came next. The tension that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Eleanor had built an empire her family could no longer ignore, and Richard Whitmore, proud and stubborn as ever, was unwilling to acknowledge it quietly. The confrontation came not in a boardroom or during a business deal, but at the Whitmore estate itself, a place Eleanor hadn't set foot in for years. The invitation came unexpectedly. A family dinner, Richard's words deliberately vague, meant to lure her back into the fold under the guise of reconciliation. Eleanor knew better, but she accepted, not out of fear, but to face the man who had long sought to control her. The estate was as imposing as ever. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and portraits of Whitmore ancestors seemed to judge every step Eleanor took. She entered the dining room to see Richard at the head of the table, Margaret poised beside him, and Charles, smirking as if he already held victory in his hands. "Eleanor," Richard began, his tone carefully measured, "it's been too long." She held her head high. "Yes, it has. And I see you're as controlling as ever." Margaret sighed softly, the shadow of worry in her eyes. "Darling, we just wanted to." "Spare me the pretense, Mother," Eleanor interrupted. "I know why you've called me here." Richard's jaw tightened. "You've done well. I'll give you that. But do not mistake that for approval. The world respects Whitmore, and I've spent decades building it. I will not let a child, no matter how clever, disrupt what I've created." Eleanor met his gaze, unwavering. "I never asked for your approval. I built my empire without your help, without your influence. And now you see me standing here, undeniable." Charles scoffed. "You're still young, Eleanor. Experience matters. You think you can run anything without falling." "I've already fallen, Charles," she said calmly. "But unlike you, I've risen." The room was thick with tension, silence stretching as Richard studied her, perhaps for the first time truly seeing the woman she had become. She wasn't the quiet, unsure girl he remembered. She was confident, strategic, and resilient. Every lesson Arthur had taught her, every challenge she had faced, had culminated in this moment. "You're different," Richard said finally, his voice low. "I see that now. Perhaps I underestimated you." Eleanor allowed herself a small, victorious smile. "Underestimating me was your mistake." Margaret reached out, hesitant, but Eleanor shook her head gently. "I didn't come here for approval or reconciliation. I came to show you that I can stand on my own, that I've built something you can't touch, that your opinion no longer defines me." For the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore didn't have the last word. Eleanor had claimed it. The power in the room shifted subtly but irreversibly. As she left the estate that night, she felt a weight lift. She hadn't just faced her father, she had emerged stronger, untouchable in a way that no amount of familial influence could undo. The empire she had built was hers, not a shadow of Whitmore dominance. And somewhere in that victory, Eleanor realized that the battles she had fought were never truly against her family. They had been against doubt, fear, and the expectation that she couldn't succeed on her own. Now, with her empire solid and her confidence unshakable, Eleanor knew the next chapters of her life would be hers alone to write. Eleanor had survived her father's shadow, the betrayals of the industry, and the whispers of doubt. But surviving was no longer enough. She wanted to thrive. Her vision now extended beyond the borders of London, beyond the familiar streets and buildings that had been her initial battlefield. She wanted an empire that spanned countries, a legacy that could not be confined to one city or one continent. It began with careful research. Eleanor and James Aldrich spent countless nights poring over market trends, emerging economies, and international opportunities. They identified locations where innovative architecture and sustainable development were in high demand, but where traditional firms lacked the agility to compete. From Dubai's rapidly expanding skyline to the tech hubs of Berlin, Eleanor saw spaces where her designs could not just exist, but dominate. Her first overseas project was in Barcelona, a mixed-use development that combined residential, commercial, and green spaces. Eleanor poured herself into the project, personally overseeing design concepts, negotiating with local contractors, and navigating the cultural nuances that made international projects so complex. She was meticulous, leaving no detail to chance. The success of Barcelona was immediate and spectacular. Media outlets hailed the project as visionary, a model for future urban development. Eleanor's name began appearing not just in London's business circles, but on international platforms. Invitations to conferences, panel discussions, and collaborative ventures followed quickly. She was no longer just Eleanor Whitmore, the daughter who could fail without her family's help. She was a global force. Yet, as her influence expanded, so did the challenges. Managing international projects meant balancing time zones, legal regulations, and cultural expectations. One night, Eleanor received an urgent call from the team in Berlin. Unforeseen zoning issues threatened to halt progress on a landmark project. The stress was intense, but Eleanor approached it methodically. Drawing on lessons from Arthur Blake and her own hard-earned experience, she negotiated with city officials, revised designs, and reassured investors. Within days, the crisis was averted. Through all this, she maintained her core philosophy: innovation paired with integrity. Unlike her father, who often relied on intimidation and manipulation, Eleanor built loyalty and trust, not fear. Her team respected her clients trusted her, and her growing network of international partners valued her vision. During a rare quiet evening in her new office overlooking the Barcelona skyline, Eleanor reflected on how far she had come. She thought of her father's warnings, Charles's smirks, and the countless people who had doubted her. And yet here she was leading an empire that was bigger, more resilient, and more respected than she had ever imagined. James walked in holding a glass of wine. "You've done something remarkable," he said. "Not just surviving Whitmore, not just building a company, but creating a global presence that even he can't ignore." Eleanor smiled, her eyes reflecting the city lights below. "I never wanted his approval," she replied. "I wanted proof that I could succeed on my own terms. And now the world is proving it with me." That night, Eleanor realized that her journey had transformed from a fight for recognition into a movement. She was no longer reacting to her father or anyone else. She was defining her own rules, expanding her empire not just geographically but ideologically, showing that ambition, intelligence, and resilience could create something enduring, something truly independent. And in the quiet moments between flights, meetings, and project launches, Eleanor finally allowed herself a sense of triumph. She had become the architect of her destiny, unshackled from doubt, fear, and familial control. Her empire was more than buildings and contracts. It was a testament to her vision, perseverance, and unbreakable spirit. Eleanor's empire had grown beyond London, stretching across Europe, and beginning to make waves in North America. Her reputation as a visionary architect and formidable business leader was no longer in question. The awards, international projects, and glowing media coverage were just the surface. What truly mattered was the respect she had earned from colleagues, clients, and even former competitors. But no recognition felt as satisfying as the one she received from her father and brother. Richard Whitmore, ever the strategist, had been keeping tabs on Eleanor's expansion. He watched the news stories, attended conferences incognito, and even spoke discreetly with industry insiders. For years, he had underestimated her, assuming she would falter without his guidance. One evening, Eleanor returned to London for a gala celebrating the city's most influential entrepreneurs. As she entered the ballroom, her eyes scanned the crowd and found him. Richard, impeccably dressed, his posture perfect, but his expression revealing something Eleanor had never expected: respect. Charles Whitmore stood beside him, no longer smirking, but quietly observing her with a mix of admiration and unease. Richard approached her, his steps measured, deliberate. "Eleanor," he said, extending a hand that she did not immediately take. "I've been watching your progress. It seems I misjudged you." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, holding his gaze. "Misjudged? You mean doubted?" Richard smiled faintly, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "Perhaps both. You've done what I never thought possible. You've built an empire on your own, with resilience, vision, and intelligence. I can't deny it anymore." The words hung in the air. Eleanor could have felt triumph, vindication, even pleasure. But instead she felt something deeper: closure. She had spent years proving herself, not to win approval, but to claim her independence. And now, in this moment, the recognition from her father was almost incidental, a confirmation, not a necessity. Charles stepped forward, his tone cautious. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said, offering a half-smile. Eleanor allowed herself a small nod. She didn't need familial warmth, only acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. Later that evening, Eleanor addressed the gala, delivering a speech that captured the essence of her journey. She spoke of perseverance, the importance of mentorship, and the courage it takes to challenge expectations. The audience listened, captivated by her eloquence and authenticity. Her story was no longer just about defying family. It was a testament to human resilience, ambition, and the power of forging one's own path. After the applause faded, Eleanor stepped aside, reflecting on the long path she had traveled. She remembered the doubts, the obstacles, and the relentless opposition she had faced, not just from her father, but from anyone who had ever assumed she was incapable. And yet she had risen. Richard approached her once more, this time with a gentler expression. "I won't try to control you anymore," he said quietly. "I see now that your destiny isn't mine to dictate." Eleanor smiled, a mix of relief and pride warming her chest. "Thank you," she said simply. Not for approval, but for acknowledging the truth. She had succeeded on her own terms. That night, as Eleanor looked out over London from the gala's terrace, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The battles, the setbacks, the doubts, they had all shaped her into the woman standing here now. Strong, independent, and unstoppable. Her empire was no longer a dream or a rebellion. It was reality, undeniable and lasting. And as the city lights shimmered below, Eleanor understood that her journey was far from over. New challenges would come, new opportunities would arise, but she was ready. She had learned the ultimate lesson. True power isn't inherited or demanded. It is earned, forged through resilience, vision, and unwavering courage. Eleanor Whitmore stood on the balcony of her flagship office in London, the cool night air brushing her face as she surveyed the city below. From this vantage point, she could see the fruits of her labor. The skyline dotted with buildings her firm had designed, the streets bustling with energy, and the unmistakable pulse of an empire she had built entirely on her own. The journey had been long and arduous. She remembered the doubts, the whispered warnings from her family, and the relentless challenges that had threatened to derail her. She remembered her father's condescension, her brother's mockery, and even the well-meaning advice of those who thought they were helping her. Yet here she was stronger, wiser, and more unyielding than ever. Her phone buzzed with a message from Arthur Blake, her mentor and confidant, who had guided her through the treacherous waters of business strategy and corporate warfare. "Well done. You've turned every obstacle into a stepping stone. The empire is yours." Eleanor smiled, closing her eyes for a moment. She allowed herself to feel the depth of her accomplishment. Not just the financial success, but the personal triumph. She had proven beyond any doubt that she did not need her family's help to succeed. She had carved her own path, built her own rules, and forged a legacy that would endure. The past could no longer hold her hostage. Richard Whitmore had finally come to terms with her independence, and even Charles had retreated from the shadows of his sibling rivalry. Her parents, once dismissive, now observed her with a mixture of astonishment and respect, though Eleanor knew she no longer sought their approval. The empire she had built was not a reflection of their influence. It was a testament to her vision, perseverance, and unbreakable spirit. But the empire was more than just buildings, contracts, and international projects. It was the people she had inspired, the team she had nurtured, and the community she had impacted. Eleanor had invested in sustainable designs, supported young architects, and championed projects that improved the lives of countless individuals. Her legacy was not just corporate. It was human, lasting, and meaningful. That evening, she hosted a celebration in the penthouse of her flagship office. Friends, colleagues, and collaborators from around the world gathered to honor her achievements. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and admiration. Eleanor moved through the crowd gracefully, acknowledging everyone with warmth and gratitude. James Aldridge approached her, his usual reserved demeanor softened with pride. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined," he said. "You've redefined what it means to build an empire." Eleanor nodded, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. "It wasn't just me," she replied. "It was the people who believed in the vision, who worked tirelessly alongside me. And the challenges, they made me stronger. Every obstacle was a lesson." As the night wore on, Eleanor stepped back to the balcony, looking out at the city once more. The lights twinkled like stars, each one a reminder of her journey from doubt to dominance. She thought of the young woman she had once been, the one told she'd fail without her family's help, and marveled at how far she had come. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her father. "You've built something extraordinary. I see it now and I respect it. You are truly unstoppable." Eleanor smiled faintly and typed back, "Thank you, but I was never stopping for anyone. This is just the beginning." In that moment, Eleanor realized the truth she had discovered over years of struggle, mentorship, and determination. True power, true legacy is not inherited, borrowed, or given. It is earned. It is forged in the fire of adversity, tempered by resilience, and sustained by vision. She turned away from the balcony and looked at the celebration inside, at the people who had shared in her journey, and felt a deep sense of peace. Her empire was not just buildings or profits. It was a testament to her courage, ingenuity, and unyielding determination. Eleanor Whitmore had built an empire her family could not ignore, a legacy that would endure, and a life that was entirely her own. And as the city below shimmered with possibility, she knew this was only the beginning of a story that would inspire generations to come. The girl who had been told she'd fail had become a woman who had conquered the impossible, and the world had taken notice.